I would like to thank you first for inviting me and to express my once more my regret to not having been able to come to Belgrade in October when I saw the photos from board. I was really envious and I would have really liked to join you, but it was just a moment, it was not possible. Before I start, I would like to take the opportunity to do some self-propaganda because I was part of a very fruitful network of colleagues among Hannes Granditz from Humboldt University, Xavier Bougarel, colleagues from Paris, who have established a network on studying or have tried to foster the local approach to Southeast European history in the Second World War, and this is one of the outcomes of this project and networks, and it's really a special issue of this journal, which I happen to be the editor of, and it contains contributions which give an idea of the state of the art of research on the Second World War in Southeastern Europe, and my idea is to give it to you in the end, but I would like to pass it around, and whoever is interested might just talk to me, and I will be glad to give you, maybe Zordan, just give it, and then it comes back here. Now, I'm very glad that you really spoke on a Yugoslav level in your paper, because that's what I'm going to do too, even though I'm going to focus then on my mines in Slovenia and Serbia. And you've heard already about Bor and Trepča. You already know where the prisoners or the forced laborers who were there came from, thanks to the speech that we heard. And so I'm going to focus on the connection between supply regimes and physical labor during the war in Yugoslavia, taking these mines as an example. Now, the ground prepared for who wishes to research supply regimes in Serbia can refer to merely parts of the larger patchwork that Yugoslavia represented during the war. While there have been several studies on the German economic exploitation and the German ideas of economic supplementary area, Ergänzungsraum, the actual question of supplies, both of the army and of civilians, rarely was given much attention. Rather, scholars have given bird's eye views of structural economic exploitation, and more recently on the labor force, and this was done by Zordan, who's sitting here among us. The miners are a metaphor for a situation in between. They were privileged in terms of food rations, as was the army. And in the course of the war, the skilled workers among them, and not only these, were conscripted to work in the mines rather than conscripted to serve in the army, whether they wanted this or not. The physical labor of soldiers and civilians, and miners in my case, competed in food rationing schemes. By comparing German-occupied Serbia with German-occupied Slovenia, I would like to illustrate the merit of a local approach. Such an approach not only takes the occupied society as its point of departure, rather than the occupying forces, as is done very often, it also illustrates how the contingent local situation conditioned experiences of violence, hunger, forced labor, survival, and death. And in the Yugoslav story, Slovenia was a whole different story than the copper mine in Bor in eastern Serbia. And still, shortage, deprivation, and hunger prevailed everywhere. During the interwar period, Yugoslavia's economic dependence was huge, not only with regard to Germany, but also with regard to France and Great Britain. Germany did not need the attack on Yugoslavia to get a hold of Yugoslav industrial plants. For example, in 1940, after Germany had occupied France, it took over the French assets of Europe's biggest copper mine in Bor, which we've heard about. And you can see where it is. When Germany then attacked Yugoslavia in April 1941, it took over also those mines that were controlled by British capital and technological know-how, like the lead and zinc mines in Mežica in northern Slovenia and in Trepča in northern Kosovo. The Yugoslav mining industries and the granary that was the Barnard were important for the German war economy. With the British sea blockade of 1939, no access to copper ores and other ores from overseas was possible anymore. Serbian copper became ever more important, as became the exploitation of other mines in the German-controlled areas. Now, histories of supply, food, shortages, and hunger tend to focus on the distribution of agricultural goods and about Nazi agricultural policy, the most horrific of which was the so-called hunger plan that killed millions of prisoners of war and civilians in the Soviet Union. As is the case with so many other research tropes concerning the war, Southeastern Europe has been left much on the margins, also with regard to the question of supplies. The most horrific of the Balkan hunger catastrophes in Greece was dealt with by Violetta Ioannidou in her pioneering Famine and Death in Occupied Greece, 1941-44, which was published in 2006. When Lizzie Collingham published her book The Taste of War, World War II and the Battle for Food in 2013, she still had little more than Ioannidou's book to turn to when looking at Southeastern Europe. Her book has a global perspective in which the Balkans beyond Greece remain a blank spot, which of course they were not. Now I will first give some more general idea about the role of physical laborers and miners, prominently among them, in the nutrition schemes conditioned by the war. And then I will give an overview of how Yugoslavia reacted to the outbreak of war with supply regulations. And finally, I will give some insights into the situation after 1941, that is, after Yugoslavia was occupied and dismembered, with a focus precisely on mining industries in Serbia and Slovenia. Lizzie Collingham notes how physical activity generally increased dramatically as a consequence of the war because of infrastructures breaking down, like public transport, people had to walk much more, etc., and because of all sorts of shortages. Thus, generally, the need of food actually increased for almost everybody. She points out that agricultural laborers were recruited into the army, leaving their fields unattended, or rather leaving all the work to their families at the home front. The mining industries also recruited men, and the tension between recruitment into the army and into the mines persisted throughout. Especially the lack of learned workers increased in the course of the war. Workers in heavy industry lost their productivity when they were undernourished, and especially when malnutrition was a feature of an unskilled and overworked workforce. Because of the war-induced food shortenings, Ruhr Valley miners in Germany, for example, lost up to 6 kilograms of weight during the winter of 1941-42, resulting in a loss of productivity between 15 and 43%. And it was such observations which prompted the Nazi leadership to look towards the occupied territories for foodstuffs, without regard for the consequences for the indigenous populations. The Wehrmacht was the best provided body, and the workers began to demand the same rations. While the German rationing system acknowledged the need of physical laborers for larger quantities of food, the reality of food provisioning remained too low for the physical demanding war industries. Upon recognizing that the high-calorie needs of miners, upon whom so much of the war effort depended, were not being met, Göring had issued a decree which stipulated that miners working overtime should be provided with a warm meal. However, the meal, more often than not, was simply an extra piece of bread. What is more, when it came to feeding foreign workers, the idea of using food resources efficiently was obscured by a mass of ideological principles, while Western European forced laborers received only marginally less food than German workers. East European workers received completely inadequate rations. With regard to the millions of people that died of hunger in the Soviet Union as a result of Nazi policies and actions, the intermingling of anti-Slavic racist ideology, military strategical doings, and economic exploitation has been pointed out. Adam Tooze emphasizes how the existing documents concerning the hunger plan in the Soviet Union reveal a language that is more explicit, cold, and directly referring to mass murder than the documents referring to the destruction of the Jewry. Dieter Pohl, on the other hand, has pointed out how Nazi anti-Semitic policies were much more clear-cut than their anti-Slavic racism. The hunger plan was mainly directed against the Soviet Union. Russians, Serbs, and Poles were regarded as racially inferior. The Croatian Slavs were simply transformed into Goths and turned into allies. The Slovenes were negated existence, but a good portion of them was seen fit to be Germanized. With regard to the Soviet Union, also the strong mingling of anti-Slavic and anti-Bolshevik ideology is obvious. While it was accepted everywhere that the military should receive food as a first priority, the question of how to allot extra rations to those engaged in heavy physical labor, such as miners, steelworkers, and armaments workers, was answered differently by the different regimes and depended on local conditions. To give two examples that mirror the two extremes, in Britain, equal rations were distributed across the adult population. In the Soviet Union, the government struggled to provide its army, let alone its industrial workforce, with enough to eat. Britain, in fact, is an interesting comparison. The equal ration policy demonstrably disadvantaged miners and other physical laborers, who soon were significantly less well nourished than the middle classes. The government reacted with setting up canteens, and in 1943 it became compulsory for all firms employing more than 250 people to set up a canteen where men could buy cheap extra meals. In reminiscence of the experiences of the First World War and fearing German politics, and indeed the potential of Germany's military invasion, in the late 1930s, many European countries initiated organized preparations for maintaining a viable supply regime. From 1939 onwards, imports and exports were severely reduced and many traffic connections interrupted. This resulted in decreased production rates and subsequent price increases. Speculative trading increased, and the situation was further aggravated by the masses of anxious consumers who emptied out the stores and by masses of worried savers who were knocking on the doors of the banks. And these problems did not bypass Yugoslavia, of course, which was economically weak and dependent on other European countries, especially Germany. In 1939, in the official report of the 12th meeting of the Agricultural Department of the Drava Banat, that is roughly today's Slovenia, it was stated that, I quote, "In 1938, there were signs that predicted better times for our agriculture. These better times would have come had we lived in normal circumstances. Instead, we have lived all this spring and summer under the constant pressure of events happening beyond our borders. And although we may not be directly affected, we will be unable to resist the impact of such a great war on our agricultural economy." Unquote. Soon after the outbreak of World War II, scarcity and profiteering started to be felt. Protests against price rises and the support of the Axis powers became more acute. To be sure, the self-provisional garden had been a necessity even before the war. The world economic crisis had worsened the situation of the miners considerably. The number of those unemployed in Yugoslavia hovers between 360,000 and 500,000. The huge surplus of workers permitted wages to be kept low. Between 1930 and 1937, the average earnings of a Yugoslav miner was about 38% of the subsistence level of a family of four. And this corresponded, just to give a perspective, to 1/6 of what a miner in the Ruhr Valley earned, while the productivity of the average Yugoslav miner was 1/3 of miners in the Ruhr Valley. The Yugoslav economic difficulties persisted after the end of the economic crisis. In September 1940, wages of miners not only were lower than during the crisis years of 32-33, it was even lower than what it had been in 1913 and 14, prior to the outbreak of World War I. In the spring of 1940, everyday lives in Yugoslavia were marked by the first war-induced supply shortages, and in autumn of the same year, a regulated economy was introduced. That is, for example, decrees that aimed at controlling prices, and in May 1940, a decree aiming at reducing meat consumption that dictated 2 days of the week, Tuesday and Friday, to be meatless days. Still, the supply situation continued to worsen. The regulatory provisions started to widen the control over the distribution of the goods and over the general rationing practice. Price movements were sought to be monitored, as was the work of salespeople in an attempt to prevent the black market from growing. 1940 brought a poor harvest in Yugoslavia. There were 100,000 railway cars of grain less than in 1939. Yugoslavia was forced to import wheat from Germany and deliver ores and other raw materials as a payment. And this was the moment, for example, when a Yugoslav state commissioner provided for the de facto expropriation of the British management of the lead and zinc mine in Mežica on the border with Austria. A few months later, in April 1941, the British protests against such measures by the Yugoslav state would be made futile by the dismemberment and the occupation of the country. In order to distribute evenly what was available, an attempt was made to regulate the wheat and corn traffic, both in terms of prices and in terms of usage in the production of bread. At first, the amount of wheat flour and bread dough was limited to 70%, after which in the first days of 1941 it was reduced to 40%. The rest had to be made up of corn flour. And still, this left enough wheat only to last for the next 2 months to come. The next step were bread ration cards, and it was here that for the first time a distinction was made. While adults received 4 kilograms of meat flour per month and children 2 or 3 kilograms depending on their age, workers who performed heavy manual labor were entitled to 1 additional kilogram of flour per month. And these first war-induced restrictions were soon to be engulfed, as every other bit of daily life, by the German, Italian, Hungarian and Bulgarian attack on the country, the quick surrender of the Yugoslav army, the dismemberment of the country and its fragmentation into so many occupied zones. And from here on, the plight of the population was similar everywhere, and yet specific according to context. And I will try to illustrate this with the 2 mentioned mines in Slovenia on the one hand and the copper mine in Bor, Serbia on the other. In annexed Austria, of which the Slovenian regions of southern Styria and southern Carinthia would become a de facto part, the German war economy had established a framework that was to steer the economy and the production of raw materials. The workforce was screened according to racial and national composition, and Jewish enterprises were quickly largely closed or expropriated. A similar screening procedure would be carried through in Slovenia in the spring of 1941, only that here the question at stake were less the Jews, hardly any lived in the territory of Slovenia, but whether a given Slovene person was fit to be Germanized or rather qualified for quick deportation. Slovenia in a first stage was annexed to Austria in the sense of enlarging Austrian structures to the former imperial Kronländer. The general vision of the occupier was that this was a reunification of century-old imperial lands. Mind that the Yugoslav regions of southern Styria, Carniola and Carinthia never became de jure a part of the German Reich. The partisan movement prevented this. And still the first measures in the mines were measures of appeasement. Only days after the lead and zinc mine of Mežica, for example, was re-annexed to its former Austrian mother enterprise, the new Austrian management successfully obtained a credit of 200,000 Reichsmark from the Gau administration of Carinthia, and thus could pay the workers who had not received any salary for 2 months. A couple of weeks later, the salaries of the miners were raised to equal those in Austrian mines. Himmler himself issued a decree that exempted the miners from the mass deportations. He figured that the mining regions could be regarded like massive concentration camps, which needed a certain surveillance. When Slovenia was occupied, the shops and depots only held enough comestibles to satisfy about 15 days of demand. The situation was further worsened by the poor exchange rate between Yugoslav dinars and the currencies used by the 3 occupying forces, that is, German marks, Italian lire, and the Hungarian pengő. The system of rationed supply established before the occupation remained in place and was updated several times between the summer of 1941 and the spring of 1945. An increasing number of foodstuffs and other necessities could only be purchased with ration cards and gradually declined in quality and available quantity. This concerned not just flour, bread, and pasta, but also meat, potatoes, rice, milk, salt, sugar, oils, and lard, as well as fuel, soap, clothes, footwear, and tobacco. People were encouraged to self-supply. City dwellers were advised to rent gardens, fields, and meadows, and some municipalities fostered the development of war gardens. The biggest of such gardens was the Tivoli Park in Ljubljana, which was turned into 8,000 square meters of cultivated area planted with potatoes and oats. An effort was made to encourage or introduce people to the keeping of small animals like rabbits, poultry, sheep, and goats, as to allow as many people as possible to at least partly take care of their own food supply and improve it without having to resort to the black market. The situation of the miners in this more general scheme was ambivalent. The typical Slovenian miner at that time was a full-time worker from the surroundings of the mine who more often than not had a garden as to provide for himself and his family, if he had one. So in terms of typology of social figures, he was an industrial worker with some backyard agriculture. Given his privileged position in terms of food rationing and given the house with a garden pattern, his position in a deteriorating situation was among the better ones. Yet, with a more general decline of foodstuffs, the physical laborers in fact lost this advantage precisely because of the type of work they were doing. It wore them down quicker. Towards the end of the war, Slovenia had suffered heavy shortages. Most affected were those locations that were cut off from their hinterland or the countryside due to transport interruptions or due to the controlling of the railway by the Germans who used it to provide their army and themselves. Since late 1944 and until the liberation in May 1945, Slovenes suffered hunger. To illustrate the supply situation, I mention just the fact that black market flows between Ljubljana and Upper Carniola, which had been quite lively throughout the war, dried up completely in 1945. A few weeks before the end of the war, the flow of black market foodstuffs stopped. The impact of insufficient nutrition was reflected by the weak physical condition and the poor health of the people, who started showing the typical effects of shortages: weight loss, anemia, nervous exhaustion, rapid tiredness after any kind of work, a weak heart, skin disorders, an increase in tuberculosis, deaths from consumption. In the province of Ljubljana, for example, the daily amount of rationed foodstuffs in early 1945 amounted to no more than 675 calories. And as becomes obvious, the situation was on the brink of catastrophe when the war ended. Now, the copper mine in Bor, actually the largest copper mine in Europe, was the central object of economic exploitation in Serbia, as we've heard. Here also, in terms of understanding both the continuities of scarcity and supply and the radicalization brought about by the war, we need to consider the prehistory of the war. Since 1906, the mine had been managed by the French enterprise Mines de Bor. And in the interwar period, the engineers and skilled workers were an international and all-Yugoslav crowd from literally all Yugoslav regions, as well as from France, Italy, Romania, Germany, and Czechoslovakia. The mine functioned as an absorbent for the surplus of workers in rural eastern Serbia, with the peasants of the surroundings forming the majority of the unskilled workforce. The social figure of the miner here was different from Slovenia. Here it were peasants who went to seek additional employment in the mine. They worked there when there was little to do in the fields or when they could not find work in agriculture. Still, the mine also was the main factor in ruining the agriculture of the region with its emissions and water pollution. In 1935, a revolt of 4,000 peasants against the French mining company broke out. The company succumbed in the sense of paying a small compensation to the peasants, yet then continued to ruin the agriculture with pollution. Thus, indeed, while Slovenia was an area on the brink of industrialization, here the scheme resembled more a colonial setting of exploitation. To give another brief example, the British management in the lead and zinc mine in Trepča in Kosovo was led by engineers who in fact previously had opened up mines in British colonial Africa. When the Germans took over Bor, the mine developed into an elaborate system of forced labor, conditioned by the obligatory labor that was mandatory in Serbia since the end of 1941. The supply regime privileged the mines over agriculture. The functioning of the mines was more important than providing for a maximum agricultural harvest. Workers were to be sent to the mines and any other war industry as a top priority. Agricultural workers who could tend to the fields were missing. This was the case in spite of the harvest of 1941 having been exceptionally rich. The German occupation regime requested that grain be exported only from the Banat to Germany because the confusing war situation as well as an inefficient recording and distribution of foodstuffs in Serbia led to insufficient supply. As a consequence, grain from the barnyard was exported in more limited amounts to the Reich because it had to serve also for providing the army and the population in Serbia, and among them the provisions for workers in the war economy were privileged. Bor held the absolute privileged position in the assignment of workers. In the mentioned competition between army and the mine, Bor won. In March 1942, the Serbian Minister of the Interior decreed the obligatory labor for all miners, including those that had already been conscripted into the army. In August 1942, any deportation of Serbian workers was stopped in order to supply Bor with more workers. In the meantime, the situation of supplies had aggravated. In the winter of 1942-43, only a fraction of the foreseen rations could be distributed. To give just one example, the regular price of 8 dinars for a kilogram of flour had become fictitious, as there were hardly actual goods on sale anymore. The Belgrade black market knew the following prices: 500 dinars for a kilo of wheat flour, and between 1,800 and 2,500 dinars for a kilogram of lard, butter, or kaimak. Sugar, 1,000 dinars, potatoes, 100 dinars, and so on. The precarity of the situation is shown by a decree of 27 October 1943, which prioritized food hunting over partisan hunting. The German army, with the support of the Serbian police, had to prioritize the collection of foodstuffs, even if this meant weakening their fight against the partisans. The consequence of these food raids was increasing hunger among the civilian population. By February 1943, it had become obvious that it was impossible to satisfy the need for workers merely by recruitment practices in Serbia. Increasingly, workers evicted from their workplace in order to flee the unbearable working and living conditions. As a consequence, one consequence of this was the deployment of 6,000 Hungarian obligatory laborers, most of them Jews, of Russian and Polish prisoners of war, and of Serbs and Greeks that had left Greater Albania. And after the Italian capitulation of September 1943, heard that too already, about 3,000 Italian military internees were sent to Bor. In July 1944, there was an estimated workforce of 80,000 workers in Bor. This is a number to be found in the sources, but it's not provable, I would say, but whose condition is described as poor by the sources. The labor deployment practices thus turned Bor into a massive place of varying groups of workers. For the forced laborers in the dozen or more set-up labor camps around the mine, the distribution of food was accompanied by all sorts of harassments, like making workers walk 20 minutes to the place where they would receive a precarious lunch. However, precarity had become a feature of food provisioning among all groups of workers. Foodstuffs often were already in decay and anyway available only in tiny quantities, so that the even worse provisioning among the groups who ranked lowest in the hierarchy of the workforce was rather a consequence of harassment in order to deliberately increase their plight. Negation of food was used as a punishment for any sort of misbehavior. The diet consisted of a breakfast of coffee without sugar, a piece of bread made from straw and corn flour, a lunch and a dinner made up of cabbage or bean soup, sometimes potatoes. Who did not have money of his or her own to buy food on the black market would suffer from hunger. And the contradiction is obvious. On the one hand, measures to provide the war economy with more and more manpower in a futile battle against the ever-increasing scarcity of labor and against the increasing scarcity of food. And on the other hand, a cynical continuation of maltreatment of certain groups of laborers that went completely contrary to the goal of a functioning war economy. Thank you.
So we have another 15 minutes at least for questions, comments, discussions, whatever. And so I'm already eager.
Small addition to Sabine's paper, it is interesting that the authorities, the German authorities, came to the idea of supplying more food to the workers in war very late in the war, in 1944. Because people were fleeing from war, working force was always scarce, and it was only in 44 that someone came up with the idea, well, perhaps we could induce them to work better, to flee less, we would supply more food. And indeed certain steps were made in this direction, but of course it was too little too late, so to say. But maybe the general food situation prevented this idea from coming up in the first place earlier. So I don't know, but I presume, because it stands to reason, well, if people are dissatisfied, if they don't come to work and so on and so on, let's give them some inducement, what else than food, but presumably there was not enough food for such a thing.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's really it's the whole complex situation,
Yeah.
and the question always is, when did racist ideological things take over, and when the practical feeding of workers was more important. And this, I mean, the whole cynicism of the whole thing is, yeah. Thanks.
I have a question from Mr. William. You showed some pictures from a propaganda film.
Yeah.
Who made this film, and what was the purpose of it? Who was it directed to?
Yeah. It's propaganda film, as I said, Vaktum Drina. It's German name, because there were two versions of this film, Croat and German. And made in 1942. The producer is Croatian Hrvatski Slikopis. That's Croatian name of the producer. And you can see a lot of interesting frames. Some installation of victories, and you can see how brave Ustaša soldiers conquered the village and capture partisans. It's rather naive, but a very efficient propaganda. And among them, there were only 3 seconds of entrance of prisoners to Zemlin camp, and those 2 pictures I took from those documentary, and yeah, it's about 25 minutes. Film lasts 25 minutes, and I told there's some versions, at least 2 versions, on Croatian and German.
Okay, because I was surprised to see pictures of a camp or exactly.
Yeah.
In a propaganda film.
Yeah. They managed in Yugoslav Cinematheque. They managed to took those 2 frames from the film. And for this purpose, today's purpose. Yeah.
Presumably the idea was to show the greatness of victory with a number of captives.
Yeah. And what is interesting, you can see a huge columns of civilian populations which were sent to Jasenovic's camp, and this is the document of the horror. Exactly, they wanted to show their victory and so on, but those footages are very strong proof for this mass killing. Exactly, you can see columns of men, women, children, and all those people are civilians, not partisans. Partisans in some of those installations, but the others are almost a civilian population, which were sent to the camp, and part of them were sent to Sajmište camp. Yeah.
Also, if I may add, the collection, so-called the registration collection and the deportation of civilian population of Kozar is very well present in the PK propaganda company work, which is in also in the Bundesrepublik. And there is this principle of having the Wehrmacht units and the SS units taking pictures of themselves with the civilian population they can take in captivity. Sort of almost a custom of war in the Balkans. That this is a form of propaganda that is distributed and collected. It's a sort of trophy photography, in a way.
I would like to add something here as well. As we try to connect the events in Serbia with the events of Germany, the Kozara example is a good one, as I couldn't include it in my presentation, so I will tell you now. I have come across, it's a small group, about 5 to 7 female women that came to Nuremberg at the beginning of 1943 to work here. And they are all from this region, from this Kozara region, and they all had registration cards from Sisak, where one of the camps was, where the women were collected, where they were separated from their children, who were then sent to camps for children, where most of them died, and the women were sent then, the ones who were capable of work, who were young, were sent to Germany as laborers, and they appear here in Nuremberg. I'm quite sure. I mean, it's not written in the documents. They are from Kozara, but I know where they come from. It's the camp of Sisak, so and the beginning of 43. These are all indications that those women were exactly from that region, that they were collected during the Operation Kozara. And at the end, they ended up here in Nuremberg as forced laborers. So there are many connections. When we talk about things in Southeastern Europe, they sometimes seem so far away and not connected to anything that happens here at all, but they are.
If I may join in, recently I found a paper about my own grandfather, who is also from the Kozara region and was sent to work in the Sudetenland. And he simply went missing. The document says he left the company on his own request, and no further news about him. So.
Did you look for that paper, or did you come
no,
across
it? I found it in the papers of my late father. So.
Okay.
Many things, but it's interesting. We were always told that he was the grandfather had been killed in the Jasenovac, and now I found this document saying that he was in some company in Sudetenland, and allegedly he had left the company on his own request, and as I said, he went missing simply.
And
So
how did you come to believe he was killed in Jasenovac? I mean, that's interesting, isn't it?
some researchers claim that his name is on the list and so on and so on. And it was a kind of a family tradition. Of course, my father was only 5 years when all these things happened. So, but basically he was listed among the victims of Jasenovac, also my grandmother and so on. But then I found this document, so maybe it doesn't fit out also for my grandmother. I don't know.
So you know what your next book is going to be about.
No. We're far away from that.
Scary. Okay.
I have another question for Sabine Rutar. Did you come across any kind of regime or rules or regulations by the companies that were involved in the mining in terms of giving additional food rations or additional supply to heavy laborers or any kind of that?
I think the one company of the 4 that I'm dealing with, where this is has happened quite clearly, in a sense that the Austrian engineer who came to lead Mežica did everything to protect his workers, including their state of being so they could perform good work. And that he did so he went into huge conflict with the administration of Corinthia in doing so. So he was a paternalistic Werksleiter, how do you say that in English? Engineer and in the other, and this is the one story that I've been focusing on. In the other Slovenian mine, I have not come across these kind of things. And in Bor, I think you always have to also distinguish between the workers who just continued to go there and they went back home, so the local people, and then all this huge system of forced labor that was set up by the Germans, which then involved a lot of also the so-called Volksdeutsch and the guards from the Allied countries, and it was a whole mix of peoples in this camp, and the system was one of exploitation and of a constant I don't know, I struggled a lot to decide whether it was racism that was more important or exploitation or if anybody at all thought about larger schemes of war economy in the end, because people were struggling to go on somehow. And what Zoran just said is of course very right. I mean, why did they, what does it actually mean that only in 1944 this is a so important war economy for Germany, and still it seems to have been so important to kind of show who's going to be racially inferior in the future world of Nazi imagination. Yeah, so, no.
I mean, food was scarce anyway. And Franz Neuhaus, the economic dictator of Serbia, of course, had the mandate from Göring to supply as much food to Germany itself. So if the Serbs starve, never mind that. I want food for Germany. And on the other hand, of course, there was also production in Bor, which was also very important, but then, again, at the expense of the Serb Jews and other forced laborers there.
And then you have, of course, also the hierarchy between places like Bor, and then Trepča was mentioned. I mean, there were other places, of course, in Serbia and the whole of Yugoslavia where you have forced labor. And Bor was the most important, and because it was the most important, it has received also most attention by scholars. So we know more about Bor than we know about many other places, and so it's difficult to kind of draw a picture that is more comprehensive in a way yet. So there would be a lot to do, I think.
If I may add to that, Trepča was extremely important. It was a lead mine.
Yeah.
And it was part of the Hermann Göring work, which also included a factory for the submarine batteries, which was a vital weapon of the war. It didn't generate so much correspondence and so much lore and myth as the Bor mines, but it was equally important for the war machinery. It just went about its work more quietly, in a sort of archival sense, by the way.
But on the other hand, you have also sources that kind of prove that workers that were meant to be sent to Trepča then suddenly were sent to Bor instead. So there was a competition, and there was this lack of everything, and they managed the lack, and they did it in a very bad sense, I think.
Also, there's a lot of presence of the Nedić government administration practically making a mess of the entire situation of the forced labor, because it integrated itself as administration into the market of labor and forced labor, especially directed to Bor. So suddenly you have influxes of people who were not supposed to be sent there. Like, say, the Greek prisoners of war that were sent, I think, in 43 back home from the internment camps in the Reich. They had to pass through Serbia, and they were suddenly taken off the trains by the Nedić government and sent to Bor. You have forced labor in Bor as a sort of a punitive measure for minor infractions. Let's say riding without a ticket on a tram in Belgrade there's an ordinance where forced labor in Bor is also mandated for that. Loitering, vagrancy, all kinds of reasons would actually send a person to Bor. When we research things, especially in the historical archives of Belgrade, the correspondence of the demands for exemption from forced labor from the work detachments in Bor, not forced labor but the National Service of Labor, by the members of the administration itself. It's actually are the volumes that you have to sift through to find something. That's the bulk of what's in the boxes. The huge correspondence of who should be exempted and why for health reasons, the demands for, I have a personal business to attend. There was a labor obligation in BOR for members of the administration too. So you have a huge volume of paper that goes through BOR because of the way it breeds, the way the NEDIC has positioned its own administration as a supplier of labor to BOR, to the organization taught and the Germans who are holding the production there.
There is one thing that should be stressed. What you talked about as forced labor as punishment, that was also legally termed forced labor, and of course that existed already before the war and so on.
Yep.
What most people did was mandatory labor, which was of course also forced labor, but it was not called like that.
Yes.
So it was not meant as a punishment, it was declared civil duty, like serving in the army or whatever.
Within the framework of national service of labor.
Whereas, of course, for various infringements, you could be sent to forced labor. And
Actually,
then those
I believe that NEDIC government has instituted the reverse, they have basically reverted to the Turkish term of the labor of kuluk.
No.
And it's mentioned in the
That's another.
When it comes to that as a punitive measure.
No. So you have forced labor as forced labor in many other countries as punishment for crime, for minor infringements, whatever. You have mandatory labor, theoretically for all, as a civil duty, right? Like serving in the army and paying taxes and so on. And then you have what you mentioned, also from the pre-war times, even First World War times, as also kind of a civil duty, particularly for the peasants, repairing roads, building roads, canals, and so on. So it was something normal. That was not considered forced labor. That was part of living in the community, so to say. For town people, they usually paid instead of going to kuluk, but for peasants, that was something normal. So it was not considered forced labor, neither by the government nor by the people, presumably.
May I ask Sabine about Slovenes expelled from Slovenia to Serbia? There were about 6,000 or 7,000 of them. Did they forced to be forced labor or some kind of forced labor in mines or elsewhere, or some of them were sent to Germany or elsewhere?
Slovenes were sent to Germany, and there is research on that that has been done. But it's an interesting question because Serbs. I mean, there was a sort of exchange pact between Croatia and Slovenia and Serbia, etc. So Croatians expelled their Serbs to Serbia, and in exchange took Slovenes, who had to make room for the ethnic Germans from Kočevje and other regions in Eastern Europe, who then took over their places, etc. So this is all part of a larger scheme, of course. And I have always been wondering where the Slovenes in Serbia ended up, and I'm not. I mean, there is a colleague in Belgrade, and I forget his name, Aleksic. No. Alexander Stojanovic, is he? And I've been talking to him, and I've been asking him exactly that question. If you find Slovenes from Slovenia, have they been in BOR? Could you tell me where they went and where they were? Because I don't know, and it's quite hard to.
Yeah, I know him first. He is
Presumably yes, because Serbian refugees also were liable to be called out to BOR. So Slovenes were also required to work in places where they were settled. So I don't see why should they be.
And what I have again, I mean, and this also depends on the sources I have. And again, it's Mijica, which I know best. I mean, this engineer there, he prevented the Slovenes, many Slovenes, from being expelled, but some he could not help, and they were expelled. And he has, for the whole of the time of occupation, he has a written exchange with one of the Slovene engineers that had been expelled to Tetovo, Macedonia. And it's such an interesting exchange of these two men, two mining engineers educated, qualified. One has been installed by the Gau administration to exploit Mežica, and the other expelled to Macedonia. And you can clearly read in these letters how much these two men are close, and how strange for the Slovene engineer are those Macedonian peasants he's surrounded with. Yeah, and it's quite interesting. Like, and this in this situation that we have. Yes, I mean, they were expelled and they were put to work according to their qualifications, and I also presume they, but I haven't found any.
One should also keep in mind that the scheme you've been telling us about, it was large as the initial idea. Some 200,000 Serbs should be sent to Serbia, 200,000 Slovenians to independent state of Croatia. Eventually, I don't know, maybe 10,000 were sent to Croatia and 6,000 or so to Serbia. So the Slovenes as a whole group, so women, children, old men and so on, they were not such a great contingent and not such a great contribution to labor force in wars.
Yeah, exactly.
We're talking about Slovenes which were expelled from Slovenia. Recently, I found out 3 Jews which were among them. They were expelled from Slovenia to Serbia. Interesting, and of course, they were killed in Serbia, murdered, but they were Jews, exactly.
But very few,
Among the other refugees, among the other Jews, Slovenes.
I mean, that's another question about historiography. I mean, when we had this conference in October where Sanella attended, Zoran couldn't come, unfortunately. The whole conference there was this red thread of these Southeast Europeanists saying that the anti-Slavic racism is more important in memory cultures, Jasenovac, etc., than the Holocaust, so that there's a competition between... This was maintained by Bojan Aleksov, by Xavier Bougarel, and it's true, the Holocaust here in Germany, and also, I mean, international Holocaust studies have... The priority is very clear, and in Southeastern Europe it's not so clear, and it's quite difficult to even... I mean, especially as a German scholar, you kind of say, how is that possible? But so here again, Slovenian research is focused on the the Nazification of Slovenian society, the deportation, the measures taken, etc. But I think there's little research on the little Jewish population that there was in Slovenia, at least.
How many Jews had been there in Slovenia?
Not very many.
150 or something.
Not very many.
Majority of them were on Hungarian part of and Italian, but majority on Prekomorje.
Yes.
It was
in Prekomorje.
German part, German occupied area.
Really
Hungarian.
tiny number,
Tiny.
as well as in Montenegro, even smaller number.
Yeah.
For them, it's really not such a topic.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Is there time for question?
There is time for one last question.
One to each I have. One is just curiosity, because I remember listening to a paper on the Sajmište Memorial years ago, and there the situation was that there was some sort of competition between, are we going to have a memorial or is it rather going to be a shopping center? And I have not followed the topic, so I was wondering about the present state of the Sajmište Memorial. Maybe that's not a short question, as I can. And the second
would be, I think, on the part of Sajmište, I could answer part on Topolske Šupe, which is actually on the plans to become a shopping mall.
Okay. And the second question is that I was missing a piece in your talk, which is about the Serbian people who went to Belgium, northern France. And here again, I'm talking about miners. I mean, there were Serbians in the I forget how this mining region is called, and there's also a PhD has been done years ago on these occupied mines. And I was wondering, do you know where these came from? Because you focused so much on Norway, and you said they went through these camps, and I was just wondering whether this group is.
No, they were sent only to Norway, not to Belgium. No.
Okay.
No.
So
all those groups were sent to Norway,
Okay.
but part of them stopped in Vienna region and other camps on the way to Norway.
Some were sent to France. I read something like
I don't
that.
know.
Okay. No.
None of them were sent to those mines.
I don't know about Belgium, but I read to Germany and France, and so not all of them reached Norway. But where exactly in France?
Some of prisoners from Banjica camp were sent to Atlantic Wall on the work to Atlantic Wall, but I don't know for those in the mines.
And there was this group of POVs in Germany that were sent, but just for a couple of months, but I don't think we refer to them as minors, but that didn't work out.
I'm having a doubt now because it might be that they either had been there already when the war started, or that they came from the Reich and not from Serbia. But I was just wondering because I know that there's
I'm not of a group of 200 to 300, I don't know, but they were POVs in Germany, and then they were sent.
And then they
here,
went
and
there.
then
Okay.
They were sent back as they weren't suitable.
Okay. Okay. I need to.
But I'm not sure
Look
if those are the
Yeah.
ones.
No, I need to look it up. Okay.
One question regarding this map. Banat region was under the German occupation administration of Serbia, you know. The border line is not on the Danube River, but on the
Is it
Privor.
wrong?
Yeah. Sorry, I have to say that.
Yeah. You're right.
It's growing a bit.
Yeah.
But we can come back to the question on Sajmište.
Yeah.
Present
Sajmište
situation in
Sajmište Memorial, yeah.
We can both say something about that, right?
There are a lot of plans regarding this memorial, huge memorial, and there are a lot of commissions dedicated to this subject. And now authorities want to promulgate law about this memorial, and I think it will be the first step of memorialization of this site. But I don't know. It will be. I hope during my life.
Okay.
We have a more pressing problem in Belgrade. Part of it is a part of the site of Sajmište, which is endangered. Sajmište as a camp is not recognized as a site for protection in its original maximal size, and it was where it was active during the war. About 2/3 of the site were actually recognized under the laws for protection, and they are discussed under the proposal of the law and in the work of the Commission for Sajmište. But the other part, which contains a German pavilion that was built in 1939, is actually slated for demolition for construction work of the road that should connect parts of New Belgrade to Zemun. And that part is being left out and is actually endangered by the municipality of Belgrade itself, which is the party that wants to do the construction. The demolition of the German pavilion was announced several times, and also it has brought the Commission for Sajmište in a sort of uneasy position, because it is actually the commission of the city, of the municipality of Belgrade, so the assistant mayor is practically always or almost always present at the sessions of the commission, right?
Yeah.
So that is part of the problem. Another problem is the 2005 sale of Topolske Šupe campsite to the Delta Corporation for the construction of the shopping mall, the largest in the Balkans. And that plan has been, with several amendments, changed, but is active, and the company is pressuring all parties interested, including the Jewish community, to sort of give their consent to the construction itself. It's a bargaining about what kind of commemoration should be done in place. What's usually talked about is a memorial plaque, and Topolske Šupe was a major camp, was very, very early camp, though it's in Belgrade vicinity, it was third built. And it is a camp which worked with nearly total efficiency. It killed almost all its inmates. It was active until the late November, first days of December 41. It was already closed. Between August and start of December, it worked for less than 3 months nearly. The place is significantly different from Sajmište in one other respect. It was not a place of common or same place of suffering for various populations. It did not include Serbian hostages. Hostages in Topovske Šupe were exclusively Jews and Roma. So there's no commission for the preservation of Topovske Šupe. There is no law on Topovske Šupe, though it is a place that was slated for preservation in the 1980s under the law with the status of a site with previous protection, so it's not yet classified by the rank of importance. What is the case is that under that law, these places have the equal status of protection as the ranked sites. Also, these places are under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture of Serbia and are not regarded as merchandise or land for sale. So the city of Belgrade has sold something that did not belong to it in the first place in 2005. And this is the continuing situation that we have, and we intend to raise that as an issue internationally. And we'd like to invite all of you as part of the support to voice it and to lobby for the preservation of the site.
Add something. You told something about Topovske Šupe camp, but it is very significant for the policy of using forced labor, because this camp over the night became a dead camp. It was a forced labor camp, and during the next 2 months this camp became, but in the same time, part of prisoners were sent to work in Belgrade, to remove ruins and so on and so on. But the others were sent to death, to be killed on the spot. And it is very significant. And for the public, for families of those prisoners, this camp is a working camp. But in fact, it was a camp, that camp, that didn't kill on the spot in the camp, but 10 kilometers from the camp.
If I may add, in our previous project, the one we did with the ICRA about the killing sites in Serbia and Croatia, the killing sites that are connected to the Topovske Šupe were researched, and Dr. Pisari has actually found a killing site in Rakovica that was not mentioned historiographically previously, based on the eyewitness accounts and on several unrelated testimonies. We have practically uncovered a location of the execution of around 400 Jewish hostages from Topovske Šupe. We have mapped these locations. They exist on a site on digital maps, quite easily accessible, the standard Google Maps systems. And Topovske Šupe we have also already mapped as part of the similar map for this project. The locations of the work of the forced labor from Topovske Šupe in construction of the Slavia roundabout, which is just on the other side of the hill from the camp, the loading of the docks and the railway station in Belgrade, repairs and rubble removal from Smederevo, for example, are all part of the material that we did on that. So in Topovske Šupe, its inmates are taken, when they're taken in late October for the executions, they're actually given the hand tools they're usually given. They're put on trucks the way they're usually put on trucks when they were being taken to the work sites. And they were actually executed. So it is a sort of a trap. It doesn't look like a death camp, but it becomes one very subtly, with very cruel efficiency. And it also happens with the Roma, which are brought just as the last groups on Topovske Šupe would be taken away. Actually, there were, we can call them 300 something temporary survivors of the Jews on Topovske Šupe that were transferred to prepare Sajmište for the camp, which opened it gates for the interned Jewish women, children, the elderly, and those unfit to work on 8th of December, right, of 1941. So basically, Topolsky Shipyard continues its story into the story of Saarstadt.